Great. Well, hello, my name is Kathy Macbeth and I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing at EcoEngineers, and welcome to our webinar presentation, CI Go Low or Stay Home, where we will discuss the importance of a low CI in order to remain competitive in California's LCFS program. We first broadcast this study in 2019 using 2018 data, and we have since updated and broadened the study using 2019 data for today's presentation. Now let me introduce our eco experts. We have with us Natasha Bielstein, who's a Senior Regulatory Consultant and LCFS Program Manager at EcoEngineers. Dr. Roxbury Hartley, who's the Senior Regulatory Consultant and the newest addition to the team, who has helped us establish a California presence. And finally, Dr. Lejeune, who's the Senior Technical Lead and LCFS Technical Lead, and he's going to walk us through the methodology and assumptions used in the study we're presenting to you today. EcoEngineers is a renewable energy audit and consulting firm, and our core services are audit, compliance management, and consulting. We hold a deep understanding of what drives innovation and investment in clean energy projects, and regardless of where you are on your low carbon journey or the configuration of your project, we can come alongside you with our unique 360 approach to guide you from concept to commissioning and on through to ongoing compliance. Our demonstrated experience to date includes over 400 hours of training and education delivered, over 90 innovative pathways approved by US EPA and/or CARB, over 200 LCFS pathways approved, more than 1 billion investment in clean energy assets supported, over 1 billion gallons of biofuel capacity under our management, and 2.9 billion RINs verified in 2019. In our agenda today, we will cover market mechanics and conditions, methodologies, walkthrough, results, and analysis, and what producers can do now to lower your CI, and then we'll wrap up with the Q&A session. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Natasha Bielstein, who's going to kick off our presentation. Thank you. Natasha?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining. Before we get into the methodology and very likely the reason you all are with us today, let's talk about the LCFS program and give us a little bit of grounding in what we're talking about and why it matters. The general goal of the LCFS program is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation fuel in California by 2030. The California Air Resources Board has done this by incentivizing the development of low carbon fuels. You know, unlike the renewable fuel standard, the low carbon fuel standard is performance based. So you get credit based off of innovation, based off of advanced fuels that reduce greenhouse gas emissions further. This regulation is also fuel neutral, and I know that there's some question of what that means. So when I think fuel neutral, I think that the credits are credits. So LCFS credits that come from renewable natural gas, that come from biodiesel, ethanol, electricity, hydrogen, all of those, they all mean the same amount. They all have the same value. Whereas for the renewable fuel standard, each RIN has a different value associated with it. Every fuel has the opportunity to earn the same amount of credit based off of the volume and the carbon intensity of the fuel. The LCFS has become an example to other programs worldwide. Currently active programs include the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, which is very, very active. They just passed more requirements around strengthening their program. The British Columbia program, that's very active. The Washington State program has been under review for quite some time. There's been some question of whether or not when it'll come. The Colorado State program is a program we have our eyes on to expect in the near future. Midwest Regional program, which is interesting. For ethanol producers in particular, it would give you all maybe the opportunity to see some of the inputs to the GREAT model reviewed in a way that I know ethanol producers do want to see, with farming practices included. And then a Northeast program, similar to a regional program, but I do think New York State's probably going to lead the way with that one. The LCFS requires a full life cycle analysis of a fuel to be considered before registration. So what that means is that feedstock production and transportation. So for example, the distance corn travels to get to the ethanol production facility, where used cooking oil comes from for biodiesel, renewable diesel production, looking at manure management practices for manure-based renewable natural gas projects. All of those factors are what goes into the feedstock production and transportation. Once the feedstock's at the facility, we look to fuel production and distribution, thinking about the process energy that's used, what's being used. Is it fossil natural gas, electricity, grid electricity, solar electricity, even renewable natural gas could be used. And all of those factors contribute to your CI score. Finally, probably the most fixed value when it comes to calculating your life cycle analysis for your fuel is the distance that the fuel travels from your facility to get to California, and then the combustion of the fuel as a transportation end-use fuel. Here are the ranges for the CI of each fuel type. Starting off at the top here, we'll look at carbob. So carbob in both diesel, so carbob is carb's cute way of saying gasoline. They both have a CI score of about 100. Then we look to hydrogen. So that has a CI score that has a much wider range of, below 0, but also, looking at about 60. Cellulosic ethanol has quite a tight range, looking at looks to be about 20 to 25 to about 40. Other ethanol, so this includes sugarcane ethanol, this includes cornstarch, includes all those ethanol types. This one has another pretty wide range here, going from, again, the lower side, looking at about the probably low 20s, high teens, to about 70 to 80. Electricity has a pretty wide range as well, because we're looking to, grid electricity, which has a bit of a higher CI score than zero CI electricity from solar or wind. Then we have the ultra low CI electricity that comes from perhaps some of those dairy manure projects. I know a lot of you probably have seen posted for public comment. Bio-LNG and bio-CNG are very closely related. Many of the bio-CNG pathways have a bio-LNG counterpart pathway. So the range for those is fairly similar, with the accounting for additional process energy for bio-LNG, which is why you see that those CI scores a little bit higher. But the range generally goes from about, looks like 80 to below -400, or just at -400 for bio-LNG. Then looking to renewable diesel with a similar range to a little bit bigger of a range than cellulosic ethanol, looking to the probably low 20s to about 50. And then biodiesel, the lowest there being very likely, and we know from used cooking oil, so mid-teens to the same as about renewable diesel, about 60 or so. Another way to look at that information is thinking of it in a volume-weighted average per CI for liquid fuels, and then we'll talk about non-liquid fuels as well. For example, the first fuel we'll look at here is renewable diesel. So the big bubble indicates that's a large volume of fuel that's been shipped at that CI score. So the target in the middle is the median CI score for the year, or for all fuels that were sent into California. So we're thinking to about, that looks about 35 to me. Then for biodiesel, we have a much wider range, if you ask me. It goes a little bit lower to the teens, with the median score also being lower, closer to about 25, it looks like here. Next, let's talk about ethanol. So this ethanol actually includes both cellulosic and cornstarch and all other ethanols, rather than being broken out like before. So we know that the CI scores that are closer to 20, we know that those are coming from kernel fiber ethanol. We know that the ones that are in that range, we know where these ethanols are coming from, but the majority of ethanol still coming into California has a CI score of about 60, as shown by the really big bubbles associated with it. For other fuels, for non-liquid fuels, the very small orange dots there at the top for hydrogen, the average CI score is about 50 right now. And just as a reminder, I believe these are EER, energy economy ratio adjusted. For electricity, let's see the big orange, big green circle indicates the largest volume of fuel there, which I believe is grid electricity. And then covered by that, we would probably see a fairly large bubble also for zero CI electricity as well. For bio-CNG, I mean, look at that range. That range is very large, looking to almost about 100, all the way down to negative 400, and if not a little bit lower past that. But what I think is interesting here is that the CI score for the average amount of RNG that's coming into California is still pretty high. It's still at a CI score of about 30. But the biggest bubble here is still at that higher CI score, which is very interesting because we hear a lot about the very low CI projects, but we have to remember, the larger perspective of it is the market is still having a large volume at a higher CI come in. The reason why the CIs are significant, for what we talked about, gasoline and diesel being at about 100, is because we have to substitute each one of those to reach the goals for the LCFS program. These tables show that each year, this is what the CI of the fossil fuel and the combined renewable fuels have to meet. So let's take an example for gasoline, and let's say my substitute is, I like to pick easy numbers for myself. So we'll go with solar electricity at a CI score of 0. So everything between 91.98 as shown under the gasoline substitute for 2020 to 0, that's potential credit generation there. Anything between the gasoline CI score of 100 all the way up to the 91, down to the 91.98 is deficit generation. Same thing goes for diesel. If we were to pick perhaps a biodiesel score of 15 all the way up to 92.92, that's potential credit generation. And then again, the approximate CI score of diesel being at about 100, we have that deficit generation. One notable thing to mention here, I know we talk a lot about renewable natural gas a minute ago. Fossil renewable natural gas, or fossil CNG, has a CI score of about 80, maybe a little bit lower, I think closer to 79. So CNG stations, they readily dispense that fossil natural gas, and they can generate the difference between the 92.92, if they're using it as a diesel substitute, and the 79. So when you are working with a renewable natural gas product, you can then generate credits on the difference between the 79 and whatever your fuel CI score is. So say you are a landfill with a CI score of 35. That would be your credit generation difference. One more thing for context. So for gasoline substitutes, I know Lei will talk a bit more about this, but gasoline substitutes are those that we can see in passenger vehicles. So ethanol, electricity, hydrogen, though I do know that there's a big push for more heavy duty electricity and hydrogen. California at this time, for the purpose of CI analysis, they do put those in the category unless otherwise expressed through credit generation. For diesel substitutes, we look to biodiesel, renewable natural gas. What's interesting about this graph to me is that we see the actual reduction in CI score at 5.97% for the year 2019. The actual goal was 6.25%. So as far as setting goals and actually getting the goal very close to accurate, California did a fairly good job, but also everyone participating in the market contributed to that job well done to reach that goal. Just as I mentioned before, this is another way to think about anything above what the CI score, the compliance curve is, will generate deficits, and anything below that will generate credits. So you'll see here we're talking about out to 2030. There's a push to have the goal for the program pushed out to about 2050. We'll see with the next rulemaking. But for the purposes of today's study, we'll be talking about 2023 with an 11.25% reduction. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Leju. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Natasha. So before diving into this scenario analysis, I would like to shed some light on the methodologies and assumptions used for this model in this analysis. So we picked the year of 2023 for scenario analysis of the low carbon fuel supply to California. As Natasha mentioned earlier, it depends on the fuel and the renewable fuels looking to replace either gasoline or diesel. The CI score needed to participate in the program can vary. For diesel substitute, we assume renewable natural gas, renewable diesel, and biodiesel goes to the diesel pool, which is considered as diesel gallon equivalents. While for gasoline, we can also call it carb substitute, we assume ethanol, electricity, and hydrogen goes to the gasoline pool, considered as gasoline gallon equivalents. So currently, the LCFS credit is still close to $200 per metric ton. We also assume the credit price remains significant throughout this period considered. We studied this analysis using ethanol as a control fuel due to its special value as an oxygenated blend stock for gasoline. And it's not likely to be impacted unless regulatory change occurs in the near future. In 2019, we calculated the ethanol sits at the 11.5 blend level at the gasoline fuel mix. So the next slide, and we'll show the 2019, the current conditions for the LCFS data reported by CARB. And we did actually just release those data last month. This table summarizes the credits generated by each renewable fuel and deficits generated by gasoline and diesel, and also the average CI for each fuel type. If you take a close look, for the RNG, the average CI sits at 44.4. Those are weighted average, consider all the different type of RNG like CNG, LNG, and other LCNGs. And for renewable diesel and biodiesel, the average sits at 30.6, and ethanol is 62.12. Electricity and hydrogen, we put it together, is 33. The reason I put it here because we're trying to use the 2019 data as a baseline, especially on the average CI, to predict that what's going to be in 2023 or in the future. So looking at ethanol as a replacement for gasoline, that almost like 1.1 billion gasoline gallon equivalent of ethanol was consumed in California in 2019, which is around 11.5 blend level at the gasoline fuel mix. It's very close to a 2018 level. We did the same calculation. It was sitting at 11.7%. However, the average CI for the ethanol sold in California is only 62.12 in 2019. It's actually over 6 points drop from 2018 average, which was 68.6. So you can see there's like a lot of pressure for ethanol to lower the CI. So as the CI for gasoline is required to decrease, the CI of ethanol will need to decrease as well. So this analysis will show the necessary reductions in CI score needed by ethanol to remain competitive in the LCFS market. And so the next slide, the figure compares the volumes and credits generated by each fuel type. So with the decrease of the compliance benchmark, there is a significant need for the credits to match the deficit in the market to meet the compliance goal. As you can see, the dark blue bar indicates ethanol. The volume of ethanol has been pretty stable over the past 8 years, around 1.1 billion gasoline gallon equivalents. But the credits generated by ethanol is slowly increased. That's owes to the CI reductions, the main contributors. So in order to predict the ethanol CI in 2023, we will need to estimate the volumes and credits generated by other non-ethanol fuel. So the next slide is the model we're using to estimate those non-ethanol fuel or volume. In that case, we put all 8 years data in this figure. Those data are coming from CARB. They released it from year 2011 to 2019. So using a linear regression model to project the growth rate of the RNG biodiesel, renewable diesel in electricity volume in 2023. As you can see, there is like a big jump on renewable diesel, and so I'll let Roxby explain it later. But so next slide, I'm just going to summarize all the conditions we used for this analysis. So we modeled two scenarios to project the 2023 ethanol CI. The table summarizes the given consumptions we used for each scenarios, includes petroleum consumption, the availability of other alternative fuel options, and carbon intensity reduction technologies. That to be said, both scenarios should be understood as a characterization of those assumptions listed above. If we take a close look, so under the steady progress scenario, where we consider deployment of non-ethanol credit generation option developed at a baseline rate as listed in the past 2019 data that matches recent historical trends. And we assume there is a 20% average CI reduction for the non-ethanol fuel compared to the 2019 baseline. And the petroleum fuel consumption stayed the same as 2019 baseline as well. While for the high performance scenario, where several technologies such as electricity, hydrogen, and renewable natural gas developed more quickly than in the steady progress scenario and lead to a higher supply of the low CI non-ethanol fuel. So we assume 50% average CI reduction for those non-ethanol fuel. Additionally, there is a low petroleum fuel use in the high performance scenario in order to match the goal that's set by the governor. I think back in 2015, they're trying to cut the petroleum consumption in half in 2030. So all those reasons will lead to a lower deficit generation. So due to a higher petroleum use and a lower low carbon fuel adoption rate, the steady progress scenario results in a larger deficit in 2023, which puts greater pressure on ethanol to lower its CI and generate more credits to make the credit market whole. And from here, I will let Dr. Roxby Hartley take over and present and interpret the results of those scenario analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lei. Good afternoon, everybody. So the model that we developed, as Lei said, has two scenarios, and this is a steady progress scenario, the results of it. As Lei said, the carbob and diesel volumes remain the same in this scenario. But what has happened is the LCFS CI standard has fallen from 93, 94 down to 88 and 89. And that fall has added around 10 million tons of extra deficit into the market. That's a big red number at the bottom. On the other fuel volumes, they've gone up slightly apart from ethanol. The RNG, renewable diesel, electricity and hydrogen have been tracking the model. Their CI has dropped by around 20% and contributes more credits to the marketplace. And then the ethanol volume is tracking petroleum at 11.5% by volume. And you will see that if in this scenario, the CI of the ethanol has to fall to 11.7 to keep the credit market whole. Now, if you look at the high performance scenario, could I have the next slide, please, Natasha? There we go, high performance scenario. Then the amount of carbob and the amount of diesel has been reduced in line with what CARB's plan is to reduce their volumes by 50% by 2030. In this case, the ethanol volume drops because it's still fixed at 11.5% of the total gasoline pool. RNG, renewable diesel, electricity and hydrogen, their volumes have gone up in line with the model, but the CI is reduced by 50%. Now, in this model, we can see that there are fewer credits required to make the market whole. There's only 19 million tons of deficits. And the ethanol can remain around the same CI, an average CI of 64.6, which is a slight increase over the baseline today in 2019. So if we go with the high performance scenario, we don't have to change the CI very much. But with the steady state scenario, we have to reduce the CI to around 11 or 12. Let's see how ethanol plants could actually achieve that. So the key contributors to the CI for ethanol plants are, first of all, the indirect land use change, which adds almost 20 to the CI. There's farming and transportation, and then there's the energy actually used in the ethanol plant and the energy embedded in chemicals and enzymes. And then there's yields of ethanol and co-products. Then finally, there's transportation, distribution, and then there's consumption and combustion of the ethanol in vehicles. So if we want to lower the CI, one of the things that's very effective is we can switch to using kernel fiber or use a kernel fiber itself. And that does away with both the ILUC change and the corn, the farming, the fertilizer use. Using nitrates, it causes nitrous oxide emissions, which are a very powerful greenhouse gas. So doing away with those makes a big difference to the CI score of the final ethanol. Now we can see that better, I think, on the next slide to see how the different contributions can reduce the CI. So the first thing you can do is to reduce the energy usage, put energy efficiencies in, reuse process heat, put exchanges in to do that sort of thing. Then you can switch energy types. You can use renewable sources such as on-site solar, wind power, and also you can switch to using wet distillers grains rather than drying them, because that uses energy. To go even lower, you can use combined heat and power, biomass, other sources of on-site power, and carbon capture and sequestration. Ethanol plants are an ideal source of ethanol because fermentation produces a very pure stream of CO2, which is ideal to be captured. And then finally, the lower CIs can be achieved using kernel fiber, as we just explained, and by using biogas. If you have dairy digesters close to a plant, you can use the renewable natural gas from those digesters, and they typically have a very low CI because of avoiding methane emissions. And what else can we do? What can producers do? Well, as we said, you can utilize renewable energy, restating that you can use wind power and solar power. Cellulosic ethanol, kernel fiber ethanol, has no land use change at 19.8 grams per CO2 per megajoule. And there's no confinement and transportation burden. You can switch model. The latest GREET models will see a 3 to 5 CI drop, the latest California GREET model. So it's worth redoing pathways. And it's also worth looking at what your CI would be in other markets, such as Oregon and British Columbia. They both have a low carbon fuel standard in North America. And then for other fuel producers, there's similar things we can do. I was a biodiesel producer, so yeah, I say we. We can consider low CI feedstocks. So if you're using used cooking oil or waste feedstocks such as that, you can get very low CIs. And I think any producer who's making biodiesel or renewable diesel from low CI feedstocks should consider looking at the California marketplace. You can also implement low CI process energy efficiencies to try and reduce your utility bills. And of course, again, you can look at the other markets to see what CIs you get in those other markets and see what the value is going to those markets. For RNG, electricity and hydrogen, for higher CI projects, it's worth looking at the voluntary markets because there is still value to be had in those markets. It's worth looking at trying to get more feedstocks having an avoided emissions credit. One of the things you can do is say, okay, if you're using a feedstock that traditionally goes to landfill and will therefore emit methane, if you can prevent that happening, then methane has a high global warming potential of 25, and it's very viable to actually stop that going to the atmosphere and capturing it as a fuel. There's more prioritizing fleet turnover, as they do in California with school buses for electrification. That increases the size of the marketplace and helps sell into California. And of course, it's always good to look at new technologies, because if you can increase yield and keep the process energy the same, then your average CI will fall for your fuel type. And I think that's it. And Kathy, would you like to wrap up and go to Q&A?
Great job, everyone. Great presentation. So I think it's through all of the data and the study, it's obvious that getting to a low CI is going to be absolutely imperative to participate and remain competitive in California's LCFS program or other LCFS programs as they're developing. And certainly the LCFS program's been, successful, and it's absolutely a driver to a low carbon economy of the future. It's gaining a lot of momentum into that end. I mean, just to support that idea is a couple of announcements that we find very interesting and significant in 2020. To start with, both BP and Shell announced in 2020 zero carbon goals by 2050 across all scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It's pretty significant. That momentum is turning really into a movement that is referred to oftentimes not only by refiners, but also other Fortune 100 and 500 companies as the energy transition. So you may be hearing more about that if you're not already. And this idea is certainly further, reinforced by a note that was released recently from Goldman Sachs, where they projected a $16 trillion spend on renewables to exceed investment in fossil oil and gas through to 2030. Closer to home, I can tell you that here at EcoEngineers, we have easily over a half a dozen due diligent asset evaluations on underperforming or stranded biofuel assets to bring them back online. We also, EcoEngineers was recently, in the last 30 days, awarded its very first verification contract of voluntary carbon credits for a major gas utility in North America. And hot off the press, I understand it's been reported that the House Democrats have issued a bill where they're proposing to take the RFS into an LCFS type program. So we may be hearing lots more about that. I hope while you're listening to some of these final comments that perhaps you're thinking about submitting questions using the chat tool. And if you haven't, please do. We're happy to answer questions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Natasha for the Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for those comments. That's so much to think about, and how we're evolving and how the whole industry and market is changing with
the energy transition. I'm all for it.
Going to make let's see if I can get these cameras a little bigger. We can engage with you a little better that way. So we have some really interesting questions coming in, so thanks for that. I really appreciate those. The first one was, does the fuel have to physically move to California to be eligible for LCFS program credits? If so, how does this work for RNG production that blend in another state? So the LCFS accepts the same book and claim fungible gas methodology that the Renewable Fuel Standard accepts. So if your gas is eligible in the Renewable Fuel Standard to generate RINs, you are also eligible to generate LCFS credits. And something that I don't think I mentioned earlier, but you can stack your RINs and your LCFS credits because you're proving the same end use. And the same goes for participating in the Oregon market as well. Unfortunately, I don't believe that Canada has a federal program at this time, though I'm happy to take a correction if someone can provide that. But in that case, you would be only able to generate credits in the British Columbia program. Let's see. Oh, so another question about RNG to EV charging stations. My guess is the discussion is around the very low CI scores we're seeing, the negative 630 something out of SMUD, a couple of negative 300 scores coming out of other producers that may have just closed on public comment. So those are becoming more common. I think another interesting thing that we may start seeing soon is renewable natural gas coming from projects outside of California, but still within that WEC region. It's something I know we're actively working on how to facilitate on behalf of our clients. So I do think we're going to see more and more of that as interest grows. Roxby or Lay, this one might be a good one for one of you. Was renewable aviation fuel ever adopted into the LCFS program? I'm assuming we can talk about alternative jet fuel, perhaps?
It is actually, oh, sorry, go ahead, Lay.
Yes, I can take this one. Yes, it's been adopted in 2019, but since it just recently started to opt in, so it's sitting in a very low level. I think I checked the data like a few days ago. It's less than like 0.1% of the credits currently generated in 2019. So we haven't put it into the model yet. But once it's pick it up in the next few years, we might consider to put jet fuel into the analysis as well.
Roxby, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I was going to add that it's kind of important because I think the LAX uses around 2 billion gallons of jet fuel a year on its own, so it's important to capture the emissions in the LCFS. And you can opt in and you can claim credits now, as Lay said, from the changes in 2019.
A couple questions here about the slides. So we will be sending out a recording of the webinar after we're done. So with that, I'm seeing. So is there any renewable hydrogen being produced yet in the system? Do either of you have a read on that? Lay, perhaps? I don't know that, there is a certified pathway, if I'm remembering what I've seen come out for public comment just yet. But again, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm happy to take your feedback if I miss something come out. Let's see. And I'll also mention, if we don't get to your question, we'll be sure to send you an email follow-up and answer that by email as well. Was there a new model released recently for calculating CI? So when we say update from California GREET 2.0 to 3.0, that is a mandated update that will be required by the end of the year. Through the latest version of the LCFS regulation. I do believe they are starting some initial tricklings of rulemaking, and Roxby, you probably have a little more of a timeline on what's happening with that than I do, but that is when the next version of the model will be updated. Let's see. Oh, okay. This is another great question. Does the fact that California's CI requirements get more aggressive each year ever cause projects to shut down if they cannot continuously lower their fuels, lower the CI of their fuels? I don't know that a project necessarily has shut down because it is a relatively incremental reduction. And let me know, Roxby or Lay, what you think about this, but I think from between 2020 and 2030, we're going to see over a 10-point drop in CI for the compliance curve. I think that is where we may see some difference, which is why I think it's important to start talking now about innovation and lowering your CI at this time when there isn't as much of a push to do so. So you're ready for that time to come, because like I mentioned, the regulation is going to go past 2030, with our best hope.
I would say that it's if you're making biodiesel, the biodiesel sales in California are fairly low relative to the number of plants that have pathways. It's probably 1/5 of the biodiesel that can be sold is sold, and because of that, it's very competitive, and you have to have a good low CI score to be competitive in the California marketplace. So if you're say making soy biodiesel, it's extremely hard to sell into California.
Okay, let's see. What should new producers consider to earn the maximum amount of credits? So, I think to maybe speak a little more fuel neutrally, looking up front at ways to lower your process energy usage, whether it is through one of the tactics of finding a technology that can have an increased yield without increasing your process energy too much. I know there's a lot of innovation that's happening here in the industry around that. We are hearing more and more about the implementation of some of those perhaps higher CI projects that Roxby mentioned at the end, the 40 CI or in that realm that may not have direct California access, being used as a process energy for some of these liquid fuels. One caveat I will provide for that though is it has to be any renewable energy resource does have to be connected behind the meter in order to be able to realize a benefit for the LCFS program. Can you all think of anything else a new producer could do to maximize the number of credits?
A few things like being close to feedstocks or to rail. If you're going to be moving distances, it's much more efficient to use rail than it is to truck. That sort of thing. Heat efficiency in your plants. Definitely using digested gases if you can get access to them. You have to actually physically have them at your plant, pipe them to your plant. It's not a book and claim. So there's can make a big difference.
Yes.
Sorry. Go ahead, Leigh.
Yeah, I would just add something about Roxby's answer. So my understanding is for new producer, the best way to maximize the credit is to fully understand the life cycle of how they produce the fuel, basically from the beginning and the feedstock all the way to the fuel cell to California. So then you list all the key contributors, what you can do extra to improve that key contributors. That's the key part. You can maximize your CI to eventually maximize the credits you can generate it. So if they fully understand the process in how CI being calculated, that would be very beneficial on the credit generation side.
So someone was asking for more information on the LCFS announcement and the federal government. That is, I believe, in the House. And I don't know if we all can see the questions and stuff, but I love if somebody was answering this question before we got to it. I always find that helpful great. There is an Advanced Biofuels USA article available about the roadmap for ambitious climate action, and I'm happy to send more information and the link that someone kindly provided here. If you need that information, you can send me an email for that if you'd like. Let's see. Oh, another interesting question. Okay, how do Midwest CI reduction projects monetize their credits and investments? So, and I'm gonna throw a guess here what you're asking about. So how can projects in the Midwest that are working towards lowering their CI, how can they monetize it? I think usually as long as your fuel is going to California, that you have a pathway that reflects your operations, you should have a fairly fair chance at monetizing your credit and your investment in that. What your contract setup looks like with your offtake partner and all that will vary by entity. Actually, Roxby, this made me think a little bit more about carbon capture and sequestration. You're our resident expert on that. I don't know if you have a quick blurb you wanted to add in or anything, as you start thinking about.
Well, if you're doing CCS, you have to have a second pathway. So you can monetize it very directly because your ethanol is going to, as you make ethanol, you're going to capture carbon dioxide and sequester it. And then you're utilizing a low CI pathway, and you simply get more credits to sell.
Perfect, thanks. Okay. I love these questions. It's so exciting. We have so many questions. Okay, great. Okay, a question about low CI for solar power and how it can be implemented. For solar power, can a net metered plant be used in CI scoring, or does it have to be entirely behind the meter plant with the generation full used on site? To my knowledge, it has to be behind the meter, whether or not you can split off some of the electricity to be used otherwise. I'm not completely sure. I know our LCA team could probably answer that a little more eloquently than I can. My guess is that, based off of just thinking through the regulations of, measurement devices and accuracy, if you're able to meter some of the difference, if you are having two different uses come from that, if you're able to prove that, I think that could be a good way to show that. Lei, I don't know if you have other feedback on that or not.
I don't have anything come to mind at this point, but we can, follow up with additional information later.
Okay, so how are other states such as Oregon going to compete with California in promoting renewable fuel usage in their state? I think actually Oregon's credit prices, and I'll be honest, I haven't checked them in a little bit of time, but they were fairly competitive. I don't know, Roxby or Lei, if you have an idea of what they've been in recent history. Last I checked, they were around 160, 170. I don't know, Kathy, if you've heard anything different than that, but
I know British Columbia's, they don't have a cap, and their prices have gone really high.
Oh,
I think
really?
they're $300 now.
Oh, wow. So I think, for other states and competing with California, California does have a limited capacity for what they can accept. I think in renewable natural gas, we see that somewhat because of the higher CI, renewable natural gas not having as much market access. But I think for, other fuels and other states, and I do think Oregon actually is fairly close to the capacity for their renewable natural gas as well. I think that as, with liquid fuels, when you have to weigh the difference between the cost of shipping it all the way to California and then the benefit of keeping it local, I think there are quite a few programs that will be able to compete on that scale. But I do think it will take some time for those programs to build to that same level. Another question, okay, for hydrogen, let's see. For hydrogen, in order for a fueling station to generate LCFS capacity credits, does the hydrogen itself need to be renewable, or can it be fossil-based hydrogen just dispensed as a vehicle fuel? It can be fossil-based hydrogen dispensed as a vehicle fuel. It could be one or the other. There's no, there are pathways available in the regulation for both. Let's see. I thought I saw one. Sorry, I'm losing my questions because there's so many and they're so good. Okay. We'll take a couple more here. And again, like I said, we will answer these questions by email as well. Do you expect California will expand the book and claim provisions for electricity and biomethane when used as process energy at a biorefinery to a producer to produce liquid fuels? I don't know that we've heard anything specific about expanding that, but as I mentioned before, this is a good time to start voicing those questions to CARB because they are in the process of starting that rulemaking. And I think on that note, I saw another question, and while I find that question, Lei or Roxby, if you want to add anything in. Where did you go? So another question that I think relates somewhat here is with regard to RNG, what possibilities do you foresee with CARB and the LCFS team reevaluating other manure types, for example, beef, like beef cattle and swine, and their methane avoidance calculations to demonstrate their significant potential to improve air quality through anaerobic digestion and RNG production. So swine manure is eligible for avoided methane. There's quite a few approved pathways out there, and I'd be happy to send those if you are interested in finding out more about that. I do know that beef cattle manure is not currently eligible, but that is an item that you can, I do think that there that CARB is hearing that, some of those, I think it should come down to manure management practices. And that, I think, is the argument that some people are making in the industry. Whether CARB will consider that or not, we don't know yet. We'll see as the rulemaking comes closer and closer. But I think right now is the perfect time to start advocating for that.
That's right. And Natasha, just to add a note there, CARB is going into its workshop as part of the new rulemaking process. So if you would like to submit comments, the workshop's a great place to do it, especially about beef cattle, and we encourage that. If you'd like to talk to us about that prior to getting involved with the workshop, please reach out.
Okay, Roxby, I have a question right up your alley here. Which has a better CI score for renewable diesel? Corn oil or soybean oil?
Corn.
Corn.
Quick answer. Corn's probably around 34, 35, soy around 55, 50, 55. So you'll see about 20 to 30 points swing in that range.
Okay, so I'm gonna pick a couple more questions here and let's see. Oh, I lost my place, sorry about that. I saw a question about stacking RECs and LCFS credits for EV charging. Unfortunately, to be able to generate an LCFS credit for electric charging, you have to retire the REC first. In order to be able to do that, and part of the verification program will be demonstrating that you did that. This gets right to the core of our article, I think, and I think it might be a good place to start if I can find that question. It's a great one. Hold on. Let's see. Talking about, sorry about that. Okay, if an ethanol producer were to get its electricity solely from a renewable source, such as landfill gas, how much would the ethanol producer lower their CI score? So it would depend quite a bit on the factors there that that you would be looking at, the location of the plant, what they're doing as far as process energy, how much fossil natural gas they're replacing with the landfill gas to get a better calculation. And I already know our team has done, different ratios of, 50% fossil natural gas, 100% renewable natural gas, and anywhere in between that. So that analysis is available, but it is very, very site specific, just like the rest of the LCFS program and pathways. Okay, I guess I didn't take as long to answer that one as I thought I did. Let's see if I can answer one more. Okay, let's get back to CCS perhaps. For CCS, is there any sort of calculator to determine how many credits a process would generate? Is it a direct conversion to metric tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere?
It depends on whether it's a pathway or project-based. If you're doing it as a part of a to do an efficient crude pathway, then you will find that it doesn't quite translate one-to-one. Whereas if you're doing it as a pathway for, say, an ethanol plant, you will find that it almost does. Some CO2 escapes, so it's not quite one-to-one as you'd expect.
And okay, we'll do one last question here. Okay, I promise this last one this time. What kind of CI score are we looking for if we use brown grease or fog? Roxby, do you want to take that one?
Brown grease also, what was the other one?
Or fog with grease?
For brown grease, I think the pathway is very similar to UCO because you have to do the same sort of refining, and then you still have to add methanol to make biodiesel. That's a big chunk of the CI score. So cleanup and refining is going to, and then transportation is going to leave you with a CI around 15 to 20.
Perfect. Well, I think with that, we'll let you all go, and we really appreciate the questions and all the comments, and it was great to have you all join us. Like I mentioned, Kathy, I don't know if you know the timeline for the recording coming out, but that will be available to you all, and we will be following up with you all by email on some of these questions that we didn't get to. And please let us know if you have any other questions for us that you didn't get a chance to ask.
Right. Great job, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.